Hi, everyone, and welcome to this summer mini episode of Dogs Unknown. I'm Sarah Fraser, joined by fellow host Brian Burton, and we have a pretty fun topic today, I think. We are going to delve into the question of whether telling your dog no can have a place within a positive training approach. I think it's a pretty fair question. It's one we actually get asked a lot by new clients who come in who are curious how this is all going to work. And it's understandable because there's a lot of emphasis in positive training, as there should be, on trying to set your dog up to succeed, trying to help them make good or desirable choices, training in a way that they generally enjoy or want to listen to cues, and allowing a lot of choice and control whenever possible so that they have the option to kind of opt in or opt out. So, and those are all really good and I think important concepts, but they don't really answer the question fully anyway. They can impart sort of over the long term, but what about those times when you need your dog to stop doing something or maybe start doing something in the now, and they're not opting in or following cues, or maybe they don't have those skills under their belt yet even? Mm-hmm. What happens, and how do we handle those situations in a way that protects our dog's behavioral health and also protects the relationship that we have with them as well, and kind of supports like a healthy relationship dynamic? So I don't know about you, Brian. I'm really excited to talk about this today because I think it's a really misunderstood and just fuzzy is a better word. Yeah. It's a really fuzzy question and concept that I don't think gets enough attention at a more nuanced level.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think part of that too is, so much advice out there is online or in, Instagram Reels or TikTok videos and different things. And I actually think the intent from a lot of positive reinforcement trainers is actually good because this conversation is very nuanced and it's very specific to the dog and the relationship and all of those types of things. So it's really hard to put out little sound bites for this topic. And it's nice we have a long form to do this. To be perfectly honest, I'm already thinking in my head, can we even pull anything from this episode, for like our short form content that we actually do? But it's also like just one of the topics I think that pet owners find really, really interesting. And also I think it just helps them have a better relationship with their dog. They're much less frustrated for sure. And I think a lot of times the dogs are less frustrated too. And we'll get into it, but there is a lot of nuance there, and you have to be very careful. Yes. About how you're doing it and those types of things. And we'll get into that, but I'm really excited about it because yes, it's a question that comes up a lot. I think sometimes people are almost a little nervous to ask us about this. Like, how do I tell my dog no? Or how do I set boundaries with my dog? Because of what they read online and sort of the different cultures that exist out there. So I'm definitely excited to have this conversation. Hopefully this one gives people a little bit more information on how to think about it and maybe feel a little bit more comfortable asking their trainer if this is something that they're concerned about or wanting to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So we thought it'd be helpful to kind of run through some broader principles or concepts to keep in mind around this whole idea of saying no. We're saying no, but that's sort of we don't mean literally saying the word no.
No.
In a way that, again, as I said before, like protects your dog's behavioral health and really supports your relationship instead of potentially damaging it.
Right.
And so I think the first point that we wanted to talk through and focus on is, whenever possible, focus on boundaries instead of rules.
Yeah.
And what we mean by that is boundaries are something that you set in relation to yourself and your home, and they're your responsibility to enforce.
Right.
Rules are something that you impose on someone else, and in this case, it would be your dog, and you're sort of putting the responsibility on them to follow. So that emphasis on boundaries instead, and placing the responsibility on yourself to be consistent in how you enforce those boundaries in a kind, gentle way, can actually be part of a really happy, healthy relationship between, two members in a household, in this case, you and your dog. Whereas rules, I think, can sometimes invite conflict and almost power struggles from the human point of view anyway. Why aren't you following my rules?
Right.
Instead of, I need to enforce my boundary.
Right.
That I've set for myself in my home. I don't know if we want to expand on that a little bit with maybe some examples of what the difference might be for people, if we can think of a few of those. But I find that to be a really important one, even for myself in daily living with our dogs. Like, it really helps me keep a lot more positive mindset around this.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think I do think that mindset is really, really important, because I think you touched on it there. Is like really the goal. Like this should not raise conflict, like in the household or the relationship, because if it is, it's going to be very counterproductive. Right. So I think like that's like number one is like, anytime we're telling your dogs not to do, if we're giving them some sort of like the boundaries, or telling them we don't like what they're doing or whatever, if it's raising conflict or stress or any of those things, like that is not at all like the purpose of any of this. And so I do like that boundary setting, because I do think that that mindset, because I think that approach makes it I think the dogs perceive it very differently based on how we're communicating those boundaries through our body language, through our voice, or whatever we're actually using. And if it's done in that way, then it can be really helpful. But I think that's like a key thing here, and this is where a lot of this gets into nuance and things we talk about with clients with this, is like number one is, if it's raising conflict, you have to stop, because it will make things worse, almost certainly. But the good thing is most of the time that's not going to happen. But I think it's an important point to have.
Yeah, and maybe that gets into one of the later points too, about not confusing boundary setting with punishment.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. We're not out to sort of punish behaviors.
No.
We're just setting nice, clear boundaries about how we'd like our house to run, and how we'd like sort of interaction with ourselves. And it might be something as simple as, if we look at like when we come into the door, come in our front door, and our dogs are really excited to see us. And we might say, if it was a rule, we might say, you are not allowed to jump on me.
Right.
Right. Responsibility on the dog. Keep your paws on the floor.
Right.
Right. And there would be positive ways to train this, and there are ways you could try to punish this behavior or discourage it. Boundary setting might be, I need space when I come in the door, so I need this entryway clear.
Right.
Right. And so what that might look like for you with your dog is, it might be something as simple as you have gates up, but it might be, if you come into that space when I come in the door, I'm going to pick up your little house leash and guide you over to your bed and ask you to stay and wait there. And you get off, I'm going to put you right back again.
Right.
Right. Assuming you've done some work and taught that skill. But like, that would be, to me, an example of maybe a boundary that you've set. I want space when I come in the door, so that I can put the bags down and not trip over you and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Versus, you're not allowed to jump on me when I come in the door.
Yeah. Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that makes total sense.
So that focus on boundaries versus rules, I have found personally really helpful. And I think it's been helpful for a lot of clients as well. One of the other ones, the second point that we kind of want to go into here, and this is a little silly, but I think helpful, is if we think about the whole landscape or blueprint of your relationship with your dog and all your interactions with your dog, if we think of it as a house, then we can think of the proverbial no as the bathroom, the bathroom in your house. It can be, truthfully, a really necessary part of the blueprint, right? To like have a functioning house,
right,
or a functioning relationship. It can be a little bit uncomfortable to live in a house that had no bathroom.
Right.
Right. But it should take up only a very small footprint of your entire relationship.
Right.
Right. Like, I don't think anyone would want to live in a home that has like a toilet next to the stove and maybe one next to the couch, and like maybe there's a tub by the entryway. Like, that would get a little weird and unpleasant for everyone. Right. Like visitors, the people who live there, just a little uncomfortable. So think about no in that way. Right. Like, this gentle boundary setting can be really important. It should make up a pretty small percentage of a very small percentage of your overall relationship with your dog. And I think we'll talk a little bit more in one of the later points about what those other elements of the relationship should focus on, so that it can be a small footprint within the house that is your relationship. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Brian, but I do find it to be a helpful analogy, if a weird one.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little weird, but it definitely works. Yeah. And I think that this is something too, where honestly, I think for me, most of the time, if I have these conversations with clients, it tends to happen a little later in the relationship. Like, it doesn't always happen out of the gate, because, and we'll talk a little bit more about like when is it fair to do this? What do we have to teach them? All of those types of things. But I think the thing is, especially someone who is sort of new to doing training and behavior stuff with their dog, it's really easy to over rely on the bathrooms. Like it's really easy to build a house with a lot of bathrooms that isn't really effective either. But I do think one of the reasons why it's a good analogy is I do think with my clients, when I work with them, this is a topic I'm usually not going to do right out of the gate. And part of the reason why is I've noticed, like, many years ago, like if I focused on this too early, I would end up with a house full of bathrooms. Like, and it's not because people are trying to be mean to their dog or anything. It's just, it's really easy to just kind of like be saying no to everything and trying to control behavior that way. And it's really not going to get you to where you want to go. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the things that need to be in place, I think, before we start adding this in. But I think that point about like the bathrooms and it being a small portion of the actual way we're communicating and living with our dog is so, so important. And it can be really hard to see, I think, as a person sort of new to training and behavior into dogs. And so that's why I like to focus more on, we'll talk about this more about like what we're teaching. When is it appropriate to actually set these boundaries and then lead into it? Because if you go into it too quickly, like nobody wants a house full of bathrooms. So, and that's one of the things you have to be really careful of.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up and sort of emphasized and drove that point home, because I don't think it can be overemphasized. And I think it's something that, truthfully, it's one of the reasons why I know when we talked about earlier on, like why often this isn't talked about a ton when you look at like general sort of positive training information, because it's just so easy to want to, take it and kind of run with it a little too enthusiastically. And that doesn't even mean in a harsh way or in like an overly punitive way, but just,
well, I mean, it seems easier, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like teaching stuff, like teaching a dog to do the stuff we want to do takes effort. And especially if there's behaviors that are sort of frustrating or annoying, it's a much easier thing to reach for because it's so easily accessible. And so, so I mean, I think that's where it comes from a lot of times. And so, I mean, this is important, with people and with people relationships too, but even more so, I think, when we're dealing with a different species that doesn't communicate through vocabulary and those types of things, that it's really easy for that to not go the way we want it to go.
Yeah. Yep. 100% agree. So I think that leads us into, I think this next point will serve kind of a dual purpose here. One is to help us explore a little bit more. Brian, what you referenced was like starting to kind of walk through like when and how is it fair to do this. But I think the other point before we get into that is just how important it is to learn from the no's, right? Like if you're having to set a boundary over and over again, it's really important to think about why. And it's not fair to blame it on some sort of like internal character defect of your dog, right? I think it's like, that's a really important piece. It's not like, oh, he's just a rotten dog. He might be like an anxious dog, or, there might be other things playing into it that we'll talk about, but it's really important to learn from the no's. If you're having to do something over and over and over again, and I don't mean like you set a boundary 3 times and you're done, because that's not a reality either. But it's important to really examine, hey, what else can I do here to help provide more clarity and to have this be more effective, or to have it be something that's easier for my dog to understand and sort of agree with, right? So one of the things that there's other ones that are really important, but one of the simplest ones to ask if you find yourself sort of repeatedly setting a boundary is just, are you being consistent? Right? Like, are you consistently responding in the same way, with the same demeanor every time? Or is it like 80% of the time I do, or 60% of the time I do? Because if that's the case, it can be really hard for the dog to understand, is this really a boundary, or is it just, something that happens sometimes? So I say that with the caveat that we're going to talk about a whole bunch of other very important things to consider, so that you don't just we're not suggesting, hey, if your dog's not following your boundaries, it's just because you're not being consistent.
Right.
Right. Because like there are a lot of other very important things to consider, but it is one to ask yourself and be honest about.
Yeah, it is. And it's also, I think this is also important too, especially when you get into households with multiple people, that like, is that boundary consistent across members of the family? Because if not, it's the behavior's not going to be consistent. And it's not fair to expect the dog to know when the rule, like when the boundary's on, when the boundary's off, who to do it with, who not to do it with. And it's
and I would say best case scenario there, some dogs will figure out, well, I do it this way with this person and that way with that person. But there still seems to be an overall expectation of like, well, you should do it the same with every person. But that's the best case scenario in that situation.
Yeah, it is. And you know, it's like that. And like the example I can think of with that is like with the jumping up example, because like I was visiting a family member this weekend, and like a German short hair pointer puppy, lovely puppy, is great, by the way. And the jumping up was actually really good for German short hair pointers. Actually did really good, but it was like, yeah, we kind of like have, you know, goal maybe not to have him jump up so much. And then he came over, and as he was telling me, he invited the dog over to give him a big hug on top of his shoulders.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, you know, and it's like, that's fine. Like if that's what you want your dog to do, and we know that they might jump up sometimes because maybe those boundaries aren't clear, that's fine. But I think then it's just being realistic about like, okay, so what are we actually teaching the dog? And if we know like that means they are going to jump up sometimes, and they're going to jump up sometimes if you want to live with that. Like there's no judgment about it. But if it's something that we actually want to really reduce as much as we can, then that boundary has to be really consistent. And I know like you can teach dogs to do it on cue and different things, but that gets a little bit more complicated. But I think it's just, again, like it's not just like when you come in through the door, it's like all kinds of different situations with that jumping up, and how consistent is it being, and is it being consistent across the whole family?
Yep. Very good point. I think one of the other things to ask is the boundary that you're trying to set fair? This is a little bit of a trickier question sometimes, but is it fair based on your dog's behavior profile, based on their health status, based on their learning background? You know, like say we have a dog who, that same example, coming in the door, and you want that boundary of setting space at the door, but maybe you have a 10-week-old puppy and they really haven't started to learn skills yet, and they're a 10-week-old puppy. Well, it's not really fair as part of that boundary for you to expect them to, on cue, you know, run 30 feet away to their bed and stay there for 7 minutes.
Right.
Because they just can't do that yet. Right. Like we haven't taught them that, and they don't really probably have the self-control to do it for that long at that age. So is it fair? You know, another example I'm trying to think of, like related to health status, might be something like.
Yeah. So another example would just be dogs that are, you know, maybe have like some emotional challenges around certain things. So like with someone coming in and jumping, if it's not just like they're just excited, like they're actually nervous or angry, or like they're being aggressive with someone coming in through the door, at that point, there's a whole lot of work we have to do to get the dog way more comfortable in those situations before we ever even think about adding in a boundary. And I think one of the tough things about that one is like, those are the situations where people want to add boundaries the quickest.
Yes.
Right. Because they have safety concerns. It's, you know, it's annoying. It can feel embarrassing, all of those types of things. But a dog who's really just emotionally they're not really able to learn when they're in this. So like, what do we have to do to actually allow them to feel comfortable? And whether like that's like they're gated in another room where they can kind of see the entrance from like a far place away, or maybe they're in a pen where they get like their Kong when people come in. Like there's all kinds of different things we can do where we create that space for them, help them feel more comfortable. And then as they get further and that situation becomes less and less and less stressful, there might be things that we can do to, you know, to add in some boundaries and things. But I think like that's one where it's, especially when we have this conversation and there's a dog who maybe has like some behavior modification goals, like where those boundaries are set, a lot of times can't be set in the situation where they're actually being triggered and acting aggressive.
Absolutely.
Because one, it's probably not going to work. And two, it could really backfire as well in those situations.
Yep. And but to your point, I know that's like often the place where people feel they would need to add them the most.
Yes.
Impart some information of like, I'm I'm making it not it's not an option for you to approach and charge at this guest.
Right.
When really it's like, well, it's not an option, but not because they're like mentally restraining themselves somehow, just because we've set up the environment in a way that's, makes it easy for them. Like it's not a physical option.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's emotionally, we're just trying to help them cope with the situation and feel a whole lot better about it.
Yeah.
So I really like that example. I think some other things to look at when we're saying is a boundary that we're trying to set fair is things like, are your dog's wellness needs being met? Like, are they getting enough exercise and enrichment and sleep and things like that? And this can come down to things like, again, this is not to revisit the jumping one over and over again, but I think it's a valid one is if it's like, say if your dog spends long days home alone, and they don't get a lot of exercise and they're a really young, energetic dog. And you are like, oh, I've been trying to set this boundary at the door for, 7 months. I do the same thing every time and it's just not working. Like they're so over the top excited. Well, it might be like, it may be important to revisit and look at like, well, maybe I just don't have the capability to help, follow through on that boundary because there's so much pent up energy and need for kind of connection that we need to meet those needs first. And then all of a sudden the excitement at the door and setting that boundary around, hey, I just need some space when I come in, all of a sudden becomes so much easier to follow through on and enforce. So I think that's an important one is looking at sort of are those wellness needs being met. And then I think it's also, and this is the information or the advice I think that usually is given within a positive training framework. And it is such important advice. But this is, if you find yourself setting a boundary over and over again, or if you are just thinking about what boundaries are important to you, asking the question, what skills could we teach our dog to help the situation become more manageable for both of you?
Yes.
Right? Like what could they do instead? What could I ask them to do instead of just interrupting and redirecting what I don't want them to do, right? Stay clear of the doorway. Can I teach them stay clear of the doorway and go hang out on your bed while I come in and I'll reward you for that? So identifying those alternate skills is so valuable and it's so helpful. I think less frustrating and way more clear for the dog and the person in the relationship.
Yeah, it is. And I would say, honestly, like 99% of the time, or if I'm talking about this, it's usually like, what are we teaching the dog to do in those situations? Mm-hmm. I would say like the vast, vast majority of situations, like, hey, what are we teaching the dog to do? And there's two reasons for that. One is we want the dog to know what to do instead. So if we are interrupting or redirecting, what do we want them to actually do instead? And we might need to do some work over a week or 2 or 3 weeks to teach some sort of skill that we want them to do. And then the other thing too, I find it also enables owners to be in that mindset that, hey, like this boundary that I'm setting is really to kind of get you and reset you to what I want you to actually do, as opposed to just trying to like interrupt or stop the behavior.
Again, that's sort of like the boundary is not a punishment.
The boundary is not a punishment. And I think that's like the tough thing with this a lot of times, like that nuance of that is so hard to put like in little clips or like little things. And it's like, but I also think that kind of gets lost in translation, that we're just redirecting,
right?
Or we're just interrupting, when really it's like, yeah, we are sort of interrupting, redirecting, but we're doing it to a specific thing that we want them to do. And that thing, usually in some way, we want to reinforce that, especially in the beginning. So that becomes more and more the norm, and it becomes easier and easier and easier to set that boundary where hopefully you don't have to do it as much anymore.
Right.
Yeah. And I did want to say too, like, I think the other thing is like, yeah, if you feel like you're constantly setting a boundary and you feel like either your voice is escalating or, you're doing those types of things, and you need to go back to the drawing board, because like that's not the point of this.
Absolutely. One thing that was coming to mind as an example, that I think might be helpful to run through with all the sort of the factors that we just brought up, and maybe with one last one before I bring up the example. I think one other one tied into what you're saying about the vast majority of what you do a lot of times is teaching the dog what to do in a certain situation.
Yep.
And I would say coupled as part of that is also making the environment work for you 100%. And the dog.
Yes.
While they're learning, and truthfully also after they're learning.
Yes.
So using things like gates or like if your dog barks out the window and you generally enjoy a relatively quiet home, like using things like window film to block vision, like make sure the environment's not working against you, and is actually working for you. I think that's another huge piece too.
Yeah, like it is. Like, I would agree with you. And in some ways, the environmental piece is, I think, sometimes more important than the actual training piece. I mean, they're both like kind of equally important, but like there's sometimes like none of that would work unless the environment was set up appropriately.
And it's generally low effort, very high impact.
Like, for example, like one of the ones that's most common, or one of the most common ones is like dogs maybe that the owner doesn't want them on the couch. And it either can be because they just don't want them up on the couch, and that's fine. And just for like, we don't care if dogs are let up on the couch or not. Like some of our dogs are. Some of them
maybe someone has like, they're allowed on the cozy armchair, but they're not allowed on like the beige sofa or something like that.
Yeah. Or they have a dog who resource guards the couch. Is probably one of the most common ones that I deal with, just because we mostly do behavior cases at this point. And even just like some sort of like, teaching like an off cue. And so like for me, like the two big things was like the leash. The dog wears a leash around the house for 2 or 3 months when you're home, and there's treat jars around that are easily accessible to the human, but not to the dog. So so we teach like off, and if they hop off, we go over and get them a reward. If they don't hop off, we just pick up the leash at the very far end, gently guide them off, still reward them. But like having the leash on gives a way like to ask once and sort of set that boundary to no conflict. Hey, I'm going to ask once, like let's go, or off, in a very calm voice. If they don't hop off, we can pick up that leash and sort of guide them off, because we don't want people reaching in for the collar. We don't want people trying to coax them off or bribe them off with food, because we use lots of food in training. Reach in a hand. Yeah. So it's like if I need to get you off in a way that's safe, we have, and sometimes I have people use like a really lightweight 8 or 10 foot leash that they're dragging around the house. It's really easy to grab off, and then they can go over and reward from the treat jar. And that's when we're like, usually within days they can say off, and that dog is like hopping off and getting the food. But like if it was just the leash, or if it was just the food, I don't think it would work nearly as well.
Right. Yeah. Agreed.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think just important to caveat with people, if you have a dog who is showing some aggression around furniture or couch or all that kind of stuff, certainly this isn't a substitute for like, individual sort of coaching or guidance, because we don't have the full history on your dog. But I think it's a helpful example of ways to use environmental setup and design in conjunction with some skill teaching to be really impactful. So I really like that a lot.
And the other example with that too, sometimes with it is like, if you have a dog who's small enough, sometimes you can like block them from hopping up on the couch and something too. So something like that's a way where you don't even have to really teach off. Like we just set up the environment where they can't get up anymore.
Yeah. Yep. For sure. One of the other examples that I wonder if would be kind of helpful for people to work through, and I think this is one that comes up a lot too, where people feel it's really important to like set a boundary or make it clear that the dog understands what no means. Like for me, anyway, I've had this come up a lot with clients, is dogs who, either puppies or like adolescent dogs, who are quite mouthy, right? Like bitey, mouthy at the owner. And oftentimes, these owners will be told maybe initially, or they read online, like redirect them to a toy, redirect them to another activity. And especially for some of the older dogs, and if they're quite persistent about the behavior, that can work. It can create some really icky behavior chains. Or the dog has something else in mind with the sort of biting, mouthing, and the toy's just ineffective.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is one of those situations, but where also, if we approach this as I'm going to punish my dog and make sure they know that it's a bad idea to bite me, and you introduce conflict into this, that's one of those situations where this can escalate to a whole other situation, right? And we can really do some damage to the relationship, and we can create some other risks in terms of, even if the dog stops displaying that behavior, maybe with the owner,
you're almost certainly going to increase anxiety in most of those cases.
And they'll often be just as likely to show that behavior with other people, all that kind of stuff. So,
if not more.
Right. So I think this is one of those situations where it's like, how do we gently set a boundary while also asking the question and ticking off the boxes of what else might be going on, and what else can I teach my dog to reduce the occurrence of this behavior in the first place, right? Like I think the focus has to be on how do we reduce how often this is happening, and then how can I gently, non-confrontationally set a boundary when it does.
Yep.
Right. And so with the mouthing one, I think like, and again, every dog is different. This isn't to be taken as a recipe, but I think it is looking at things like, are there certain situations when it happens that you can identify where you're like, my dog wasn't exercised as well, or maybe it was days where they had a really stimulating day and there was too much going on. So they're more likely to do it because they're like, I don't know, low on self-control, and maybe their stress levels raised. Like maybe they're more likely to do it after daycare. Maybe they're less likely to do it after daycare.
Yep.
Looking at things like that. I think also looking at things like, or are they getting enough sleep, all that kind of stuff? Are they getting enough like mental stimulation? Is someone actually potentially being inconsistent about this behavior and maybe inviting it as like a way to play?
Mm-hmm.
And is that confusing? How is the dog feeling? So do we think this is actually maybe a little bit more of an anxiety driven behavior or over arousal or whatnot? And being mindful of that and saying, well, what skills could we teach this dog to help them settle when we think the behavior might be more likely to happen, right? Like at those times. So something like a nice relaxed, like settle in a down or settle on a mat, things like that can often be really helpful. And saying, taking all that into account, right? We've like maybe looked at exercise. We've maybe upped enrichment and mental stimulation in an appropriate way. We've said, is my dog actually stressed or anxious or frustrated in these situations? And if so, are there ways we can alleviate that? And that usually involves bringing a trainer or behavior consultant in to kind of help you parse through that a little bit. Starting to teach those skills so that then when you get to the point of, and when it happens, what do I do in the moment?
Mm-hmm.
That can be something as simple as, for some dogs, again, if they're wearing a really lightweight house leash, I really gently guide you away from me, like you don't have physical access to me.
Yep.
And I really calmly direct you to your bed, or I really calmly put you behind a gate.
Yes.
Right. Like, and we're relying again on some environmental management there to help us set that boundary in a way that doesn't involve clapping, shouting, leaning over, maybe using something that's like physically uncomfortable, like, I don't know, like kneeing them. Right? That used to be a thing,
Yeah.
right? Right. So it's like we can still set a boundary in the moment, but most of the focus should be on how do I reduce the occurrence of this in the first place?
Yeah.
I know that was a little long-winded, but I know it's something that really makes people feel like it's important to set this boundary with my dog.
Yeah.
Because I don't want them biting or mouthing at me. It scares a lot of people, and understandable.
Yeah. And I think what's important about this too, and I guess, a lot of this is terminology too, but like, I do feel like, to me, like, and I will say, if you do have a dog who's mouthing you, or like, those little house leashes or house, drag lines, we call them, whatever, like lightweight, again, never leave them on your dog when you're not there, but when you're home, wow, does that make a big difference for a lot of dogs? In this example with the mouthing, whether it's a puppy or an adolescent dog that you just adopted.
Yeah. And thank you, Brian, I'm glad. I think the terminology piece before you share the rest of this is just how important it is to clarify what we mean by mouthing. Like, we're not necessarily talking, we're not talking about a dog who is like snapping, biting in response to, say, you like trying to take something away or trying to move them off furniture or trying to pet them or things like that. It's those dogs who get like excited and over aroused and they're like nippy mouthy.
Yeah. Which can still hurt.
100%. Often like at pant legs or at arms, things like that. Like, it's that type of behavior that we're talking about here.
Yeah. And it hurts and it can be scary.
Absolutely.
It can happen a lot with kids in the household too, especially with puppies. But I think the thing, like, one of the reasons why I like that, or why I like this boundary setting, or, boundary setting, or the environmental setup, or whatever we're actually doing, is because if it allows us to remain calm and being able to direct them to the activity we want to do, that is like, not only is it going to be more effective, I also really strongly feel for a lot of dogs, like over time, it's not going to work right away. It does have like a calming effect on the dog, just because like you're very predictable in what you do. It's not scary, but you're also not in a situation, because if you're just getting nipped and bit, like you might yell because it hurts. Or you might, or even like, some people say, just say ow really loud. Like, not one of my favorite things to do. But having a way to sort of like, oh, like I can still control the situation in a way that's going to be safe for us and helpful for you, but in a way where like I don't have to feel nervous or afraid, and the dog doesn't have to feel nervous or afraid either. And I do think when some owners, when they actually get that sort of guidance on how to do that, it relieves a lot of stress for the human to be able to do that in a way and communicate that in a way that's not stressful for anybody. And that sometimes is like the biggest things like we give people, because like they might have already been doing all the other stuff and like teaching or trying to redirect, but they didn't know how to manage the dog or set those boundaries in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the key thing here, and you'll notice it's like about being calm, being able to get them to do what we want them to do, not using it as a punishment. And I know we're saying that over and over and over again, because it's really easy for this to be taken out of context.
It is.
And that's really not what we're aiming to do.
And I think I'm glad you brought that up again. Like, I think we almost can't say that too many times, you know? And I think also related to that, and you started to touch on this as well, is when we talk about things like maybe using a leash to really gently guide a dog away from, you know, a couch or behind a gate or things like that. Or maybe using really gentle sort of body blocking. And like, say, if you have a dog who's trying to, I don't know, like hop up and steal something off the counter, you know, if you gently sort of step between them and the table and just kind of stand there. Whoops, not an option, bud.
Yep.
You know, so like, sorry, it's just not an option. Is the importance of body language and how you carry yourself.
Yes.
Is like, can make all the difference in how your dog perceives the situation and whether they feel safe.
100%.
Because they need to feel safe when you're setting a boundary, or else it's not helpful, right? Yep. It's going to damage your relationship. It's going to increase anxiety. Like, it's going to put them in a situation where like, this is not the outcome that you're looking for. And in order to help them feel safe when you're setting boundaries, being really mindful about your posture, like not leaning over, nice, like back straight, right? When you're doing this type of stuff, not doing a lot of direct eye contact,
right?
You know, if you're moving in a way that's not super fast and abrupt, but also not, you know, creepy, odd, slow motion, you know, like someone lurking in a corner, just like calm, purposeful, relaxed. And if you feel you're doing that and you're seeing signs from your dog that they're either nervous or they're maybe becoming frustrated or even aggressive, like, you need to stop what you're doing and contact a behavior consultant for help.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I'll add to that too is like, there's sort of three types of owners I find that when it comes to boundary setting that we work with. And like there are some people who just have difficulty setting boundaries for whatever reason. And that's okay. There are people where that comes a little bit more naturally to them and they sort of slot right in there. And then there are folks who are, you know, just because of what they've learned previously with previous dogs, where they can just be like a little too far on a lot of bathrooms in the house, essentially. A lot of bathrooms in the house. And a lot
of focus on they need to know it's wrong.
Right. Exactly. And I think the nice thing when you actually get into this and teach for all three groups, I think like it really, well, the one in the middle kind of naturally do that. That's usually just giving them information and they can kind of go on their way. But for the other two, the ones where like that's a harder thing to step into, or for people where it's like they have the too many bathrooms, I think like the nice thing with this is like it really, for the people who have a hard time setting boundaries, I think what I've noticed is with a lot of those owners is I do think they think that setting boundaries means you have to be like really assertive, or I wouldn't say aggressive, but you know what I mean? Like you have to like, I'm giving you a boundary, and that's really not what it's about. It's like, I'm setting a boundary now.
For myself.
For myself.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah. Right. And I think it can really help some people like do that in a way where they feel comfortable doing it, where they know it's not going to ruin that relationship with the dog, or they might have had bad experience with some other trainers where they were asked to do some not very nice things to their dogs. And so that can kind of get lost. And then for the people on the other end where there's a lot of bathrooms in the house, I think it still helps. Like, yes, there is boundary setting that is important, but that's where we have to really look at, like you said, like the body language and what we're doing and when we're doing it. And also, again, it's not about our dog knowing what's right and wrong. I think is a big thing. So I think the reason why I want to bring that up is because if you're listening to this and you feel like you're in one of those two groups, it's like it's not uncommon, actually.
Not at all.
It's and there's no judgment about it, but I think like that focus on how we set those boundaries appropriately can be really helpful for you, regardless of which side you fall on.
Yep. Yeah. Well said. I'm glad you brought that up. So I think truthfully, those were some of the main. I think those were the main points that we had kind of, you know, very high level jotted down to talk about. Is there anything else, Brian, that you had wanted to touch on related to this?
I don't think so. I think, you know, The one thing that will come up sometimes too is like, what do I say when I'm setting a boundary?
Oh, yes. I'm glad that you
Right.
roped this in. Yes.
Yeah. And so, because a lot of time people say like, do I say no? Right. Or do I interrupt them?
And if you've worked potentially with like another trainer, or you've read things online, you've probably read like, don't say no.
Right.
Like there's some sort of this like, I don't know, cloud around the word. And I get it because it comes with a lot of baggage.
Yeah, it does.
And so, you go and then I'll dive in.
But personally, I do use one. So for me,
like a word.
I use a word, and we use nope.
Mm-hmm.
Right? NOPE. We don't use no, because the thing with no is it's really easy to escalate the word no, and you can just repeat it over and over again, like no, and it can be really easy to ramp up.
It comes with so much baggage,
so much
experience of like
on the human side and even on the dog side. But nope is kind of funny because it's sort of like nope, like you can't yell it.
No.
Nope. Like
nope.
Right.
That's kind of the worst you can do.
Yeah. And so, and I think there's also, for a lot of the owners that, I've worked with, like nope, people just, it brings a different set of body language and emotional content behind how we say it.
It's still quite definitive, but it's sort of your shoulders can drop while you say it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think like one of the things with that is like, that's not what's going to make it work.
No.
Right. But I do find at least for my dogs or, dogs that we work with, like, nope, it just means like, I'm interrupting you right now and I'm going to redirect you and do something else. Like, so it's just sort of a heads up.
And what I'm redirecting you from isn't currently an option to you.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's said once and then they're redirected. So it's never repeated like multiple times or anything. But for me personally, it's just sort of like, I just feel like that's like a fair thing to do. Like I'm just communicating that like, hey, I need you to do something else right now and I'm going to direct you to it.
And I think it also takes into account like we're a really verbal species. Right. So like we have to sort of think about the human need and side of things and what helps us be consistent. Yes. And for me, having just sort of a consistent word or phrase that I use is helpful in setting consistent boundaries.
Yes.
And again, like it's not that we're doing that often.
No.
But when they come up, and I use nope, absolutely. And I really like it. And you don't have to use any certain word, but we're just sharing what has worked for us historically. And I think it doesn't have to be a single word.
No.
I think the other sort of phrase I use sometimes is like, sorry, not an option. Right. Like I really do is like, sorry, bud, not an option right now. And I just say it like conversationally. And I don't think I set out on purpose doing it. I just found myself saying it.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry, bud, not an option. And again, it's like, you're not in trouble. This is not a punishment. It's just not an option.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all.
Yeah. And just sort of based on some of the comments of some of our previous Instagram reels, yes, we understand that they don't understand the language of that, but it's like the cadence and the tone and how it's said all together. Like you can put a few words together, and as long as you're consistent with it, your dog will recognize it. But I think it's important, like pick something that feels good to you.
It brings about the right sort of demeanor and body language and tone and everything else for me.
Yeah.
That I know the dogs will respond to well. It's not about actually telling them, hey, not an option right now.
And one of the exceptions to recommend, having term, if there are owners who are talk too much, then sometimes I have them not say, I recommend that we actually remove a lot of that communication because you actually don't need, and like you can just do it. You could actually go completely silent and do it. And for some people that actually works better or feels more comfortable. Like you don't even have to say anything. It's like, okay, but this is what I'm going to do. Like I'm going to pick up your leash and guide you behind the gate or, whatever it is, but you actually don't have to say anything. And I think and the reason why I want to bring that up is like, again, like it's not really about what we're saying. Right. Like it's just, how do we get ourselves in a mindset that's going to, help the dog understand what we want them to do, and picking a way that I think an owner feels comfortable with and can be consistent with is really the most important thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm really, really glad you brought that up. Because I think it's something people wonder about and something that, again, sort of feels fuzzy or that you'll get a lot of different answers on. And I'm not saying that what we're saying here is the only or is right or anything else, just sort of like what we found works for us and has worked for a lot of clients to put them in that mindset where you can still maintain that role as like a safe, predictable, helpful leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that safe, predictable, helpful is really important. And it's also too, like, I think just on that point, like, as long as we're not, again, we're not talking about punishment here. We're talking about communication. Like, I really think this, and this is like if you're working, with one of our trainers or someone else, like it's okay to talk about, like, I don't feel comfortable like doing it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Or is it okay for me to use a no reward marker or like can I use a nope or whatever? And like, cause the thing is like, there are so many ways to do this in like a really fair, healthy way. And what your relationship with your trainer, you should be able to kind of have those discussions. And they are going to tell you sometimes like, hey, like I don't recommend that. Like,
Right.
like I wouldn't recommend setting like let's just set a boundary when the dog charges the door, charges the mailman. Because like they're not ready for that yet. We have to do other things. So like, but there's a lot of other times where there's a lot of different options on the table to do this, to set healthy boundaries. So there's no one size fits all on this for sure.
Yep. Yeah. Good. Well, hopefully this was a helpful conversation for people. I think, I'll speak for me, Brian, and you can say whether you like, we're truthfully a little bit nervous.
Yeah.
About having this conversation because it's nuanced and because we wouldn't want anyone to walk away and be like, oh, good, I'm going to like.
Yeah. Instinct tells me to punish dogs.
Right.
Which
I think we've emphasized enough on here over and over again that that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, this is like the 5th time we've said it now this episode.
Yeah. But just sort of so I guess to circle back and answer that original question, like, does telling your dog no have a place within a positive training approach? It can. It should be a pretty small place, and there's work to be done all around it in terms of the foundation of your house and making sure there's a nice living room and a bedroom and a kitchen and all that good stuff. So you don't just have an outhouse.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to live in an outhouse.
No.
On that lovely note, we'll sign off and see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.